How DJT Lost the White House. Chapter 5. Agitation and Chaos. January 6 through 20. By Patrick Byrne. What happened on the afternoon of January 6 is the worst thing that could have happened for the freedom movement. Millions of people had descended on D.C. to rally in support of those standing up for the truth. Our national election was rigged. However, in the course of their protest, goons stormed the Capitol. One woman was shot unnecessarily by police, and one policeman died in a way that remains unclear. Media reports have been conflicting. Unnamed law enforcement sources initially told outlets Sicknick was bludgeoned in the head by a fire extinguisher, while others speaking on condition of anonymity countered those claims, arguing there was no immediate evidence showing that Sicknick suffered any blunt force trauma. A month after Capitol riot, autopsy results pending an Officer Brian Sicknick death investigation, Fox, February 8, 2021. Mainstream media has increased the body count by including, for example, 2 police officers who, days after the attack, putatively committed suicide. The same mainstream media that, over the course of 2020, described as mostly peaceful protests the actions of Antifa and Black Lives Matter, killing 33 police, injuring another 700 police, and burning thousands of businesses, has portrayed these events at the Capitol as the greatest tragedy to hit America since Pearl Harbor. It is nice to know there is some form of goonism in politics still objectionable to the mainstream media. Myself, I eschew all political violence, not just ones convenient for me to denounce. There are 2 ways to look at what happened on that fateful afternoon at the Capitol. I think they are both true, though which is more true is, at the moment, anyone's guess. The party line explanation is this. Splinter elements, 200 to 400 people, of the millions of protesters decided to storm the Capitol. Given that this party line explanation has been repeated ad nauseum by a supine and obedient press, and is currently the object of an impeachment of a man who is no longer an office holder, go figure, I will not spend time developing this interpretation. But I do not mean to discount it entirely, either. The alternative explanation is more subtle, and runs along the lines of my story about Moldova explained in A Message to Militias Across America regarding the goon left and agents provocateurs, not the lingerie. This explanation holds that the events were engineered as part of a psyop to discredit those skeptical of the election result, and to justify a police state-style crackdown by the goon left on the rest of America. What evidence is there to support this alternative explanation, that the ransacking of the Capitol was deliberately invited by those who would make hay from it politically? Let us review the evidence. On January 12, an article from the Independent Sentinel, Pelosi-McConnell refused to increase security. Capitol emergency began before Trump finished speaking, January 11, appeared describing a Washington Post article from the previous day. The Washington Post reported late Sunday night that the outgoing Capitol Police Chief, Steve Sund, believes his efforts to secure the premises were undermined by a lack of concern from House and Senate security officials who answer directly to Speaker Nancy Pelosi and Senate Leader Mitch McConnell. Then, quoting from the WAPO, 2 days before Congress was set to formalize President-elect Joe Biden's victory, Capitol Police Chief Stephen Sund was growing increasingly worried about the size of the pro-Trump crowds expected to stream into Washington in protest. To be on the safe side, Sund asked House and Senate security officials for permission to request that the D.C. National Guard be placed on standby in case he needed quick backup. But, Sund said Sunday, they turned him down. It was the first of 6 times Sund's request for help was rejected or delayed, he said. 2 days later on Wednesday afternoon, his forces already in the midst of crisis, Sund said he pleaded for help 5 more times, as a scene far more dire than he had ever imagined unfolded on the historic Capitol grounds. Besides the higher-ups preventing the police protecting the Capitol to increase their presence when asked, is there other evidence that suggests the occupation of the Capitol was to some degree invited? In this clip, Capitol Police allow protesters to reach the Capitol. Police can, in fact, be seen inviting protesters past the barricades. Then police stand aside and let the Capitol be assaulted, while patriotic bystanders ask them to stop it. Here are patriots catching on to what is going on and trying to stop the Antifa/BLM agitators themselves. Articles appeared the next day asking the right question. Trump supporters pulled violent protesters away from the Capitol building when they started damaging it. Who were these people? Here one can clearly see someone inside the Capitol handing weapons to those outside the Capitol so they will be able to break their way in. Then, in this clip, Capitol Police open doors for the protesters. They stand aside and invite them inside. Police do exactly what the title claims. And this one, police open the doors of the Capitol and invite everyone in. D.C. Capitol Police lets protesters enter and storm U.S. Capitol building. Here's a policeman being overwhelmed with invaders. Does anything look staged about this? And here is the famous Q shaman with 8 photojournalists. Anything here look staged? Here's an excellent sync edit showing a policeman taking careful aim and then shooting an unarmed female protester in the throat. She died. Interestingly, while the identity of the policeman who shot the unarmed female protester in the throat has been guarded by the media, there are unconfirmed reports that this is he. If one looks carefully in that crowd of protesters in the hallway when the female was shot, one spots this individual. His name is John Sullivan, and he is a Utah-based Antifa/BLM activist. Utah man with a history of organizing violent Antifa/BLM protests was inside the Capitol. Oddly, he organized a BLM rally an hour earlier that day, 11 a.m., and tweeted about the existence of BLM buses. Utah activist John Sullivan organized Antifa protests near U.S. Capitol before it was stormed, tweeted about BLM buses in D.C. on the 6th. This is significant because there were later reports of buses being escorted to the front of the Capitol in buses, only to have the first rioters emerge from them. He was arrested for his actions in the Capitol that day, then released without charges once his lefty political preferences were discovered. Does that seem odd? Not anymore. The mainstream media was originally allowed to discuss this possibility. On January 7, the New York Post published, 2 known Antifa members posed as pro-Trump to infiltrate Capitol riot. Sources. Antifa infiltrated Trump supporters in Capitol, evidence reveals. Christianity Today, January 8, 2021. For further interest, I suggest watching this 21-minute mini-documentary, Everything Wrong with the Capitol Shooting. So, was the storming of the Capitol a disgrace? Yes. Was it also engineered or to some degree staged? Put me down as undecided. LOL. On the 7th of January, 5 minutes after the Senate had concluded its business and selected Joseph Biden to be president, DNI John Ratcliffe delivered his homework assignment, which had been due December 18. He opened it up with a rather dramatic and unequivocal statement that the IC community that he was then overseeing delivered a report that inadequately reflected China's role in the U.S. election, and notes that an accompanying ombudsman's report highlights the worst sin of which intelligence analysts can be accused: politicizing the intelligence product. DNI Ratcliffe's letter, which the MSM has flushed down the Orwellian memory hole, is so shocking I am going to quote the first 50% of it. Ratcliffe, Views on Intelligence Community, Election Security Analysis. Director of National Intelligence, Washington, D.C. Subject: Views on Intelligence Community Election Security Analysis. Reference: Intelligence Community Assessment, Foreign Threats to the 2020 U.S. Elections. From my unique vantage point as the individual who consumes all of the U.S. government's most sensitive intelligence on the People's Republic of China, I do not believe the majority view expressed by intelligence community, IC, analysts fully and accurately reflects the scope of the Chinese government's efforts to influence the 2020 U.S. federal elections. The IC's analytic ombudsman issued a report, which I will reference several times below, that includes concerning revelations about the politicization of China election influence reporting, and of undue pressure being brought to bear on analysts who offered an alternative view based on the intelligence. The Ombudsman's report, which is being transmitted to Congress concurrently with this Intelligence Community Assessment, ICA, also delves into a wider range of election security intelligence issues that I will not focus on here. However, the specific issues outlined below with regard to China reporting are illustrative of broader concerns. It is important for all IC leaders to foster a culture within the community that encourages dissenting views that are supported by the intelligence. Therefore, I believe it is incumbent upon me in my role as the Director of National Intelligence to lead by example and offer my analytic assessment alongside the majority and minority views. This letter was prepared in consultation with the Ombudsman to ensure that I am accurately articulating his findings and presenting them in their proper context. The majority view expressed in this ICA with regard to China's actions to influence the election falls short of the mark for several specific reasons. Analytic Standard B requires the IC to maintain independence of political considerations. This is particularly important during times when the country is, as the Ombudsman wrote, in a hyper-partisan state. However, the Ombudsman found that China analysts were hesitant to assess Chinese actions as undue influence or interference. These analysts appeared reluctant to have their analysis on China brought forward because they tend to disagree with the administration's policies, saying in effect, "I don't want our intelligence used to support those policies." This behavior would constitute a violation of Analytic Standard B, Independence of Political Considerations, IRTPA Section 1019. Furthermore, alternative viewpoints on China's election influence efforts have not been appropriately tolerated, much less encouraged. In fact, the Ombudsman found that there were strong efforts to suppress analysis of alternatives, AOA, in the August National Intelligence Council Assessment on Foreign Election Influence, and associated IC products, which is a violation of Tradecraft Standard 4 and IRTPA Section 1017. National Intelligence Council, NIC, officials reported that Central Intelligence Agency, CIA, officials rejected NIC coordination comments and tried to downplay alternative analyses in their own production during the drafting of the NICA. Additionally, the Ombudsman found that CIA management took actions pressuring analysts to withdraw their support from the alternative viewpoint on China in an attempt to suppress it. This was seen by national intelligence officers, NIO, as politicization, and I agree. For example, this ICA gives the false impression that the NIO Cyber is the only analyst who holds the minority view on China. He is not, a fact that the Ombudsman found during this research and interviews with stakeholders. Placing the NIO Cyber on a metaphorical island by attaching his name alone to the minority view is a testament to both his courage and to the effectiveness of the institutional pressures that have been brought to bear on others who agree with him. Ratcliffe claimed that he had not wanted to deliver the report any earlier because it would have politicized the constitutional process of selecting the next president that was then occurring. He was another DC Republican concerned about optics. Call me crazy, but myself, I believe the correct analysis would have been, I should deliver this report on time so that the constitutionally stipulated process for selecting the next president is fully informed, and if that includes that the election involved foreign interference, particularly from China, I have an obligation to make sure that it is known to those involved in that process. Moving on. Sydney had left before January 6, but after the events of January 6, Mike Flynn, the Cyber Ninjas, Dolphin Speakers, and I all prepared our goodbyes. We began drifting out of town to get on with our lives. Yet on the evening of January 7, I got a phone call at 10:30 p.m. telling me that Mayor Giuliani was requesting my presence at his hotel. The intermediary said, "We are just about ready to hang up our gloves on this, but we want to talk to you about your ideas." I put my shoes on and walked over to Rudy's hotel. When I got there, I found 8 people waiting in a suite. Rudy was there, along with the commish, mediocrity, a smart lawyer, and a handful of others. I sat down in front of Rudy, and they repeated the request. They were ready to stop, but wanted to see if I had any ideas. As I started to answer, Rudy began checking his phones again, literally fumbling with 2 or 3 of them, again, reading his texts, etc. For the first time, I did what I should have done 2 months earlier. I simply stopped talking. He said, No, go ahead." I stayed silent and just stared at him. He said, "I can't turn these off. I might get a call from the president." "Then give them to mediocrity," I said, indicating the person to his left and surprising myself at my rudeness. Then to mediocrity, "Keep an eye on them and let Mayor Giuliani know if the president calls." Rudy put the phones down and slid them to mediocrity. Just as I began again to speak, mediocrity turned and began having a side conversation with someone in the next seat, and again I folded my hands, stared at mediocrity, and kept my mouth shut. I had reached the point where I was preparing to say, "Who do you assholes think you are? You call me at 10:30 p.m., tell me to come to your hotel to share my thoughts, then don't even have the courtesy to pay attention?" But as I opened my mouth, mediocrity cut off the side conversation and faced me quietly. Everyone else in the room went quiet as well and looked at me. In 2 months of dealing with that group, it was the first moment that they conducted themselves in a manner that normal business people, or even normal adults, would conduct themselves. I realized that for the first time I had Rudy's full attention, and not only that, I could see that it was the first time I had been with him when he was the Rudy Giuliani I remember from 30 years ago, prepared to take on the mob, in command, focused. The silence stretched on as I thought, then said, "These machines were sold to the public with a promise. As a fail-safe, there would always be paper ballots to use as a backup. If there was ever a time, now is the time. The FBI and CISA have both opined that our election came under foreign attack. We provided evidence of that as well. President Trump should find that there has been foreign interference, and on that basis, send a federal force of U.S. Marshals or National Guard or DHS or FBI to examine paper ballots in the problematic 6 counties and count them on live-stream TV. If there are no gross irregularities, he should concede. But if he finds discrepancies of hundreds of thousands of ballots, as we think he may, he then has choices. He can recount the 6 states, or order the federal force to rerun the election in those 6 states. He might even be able to have it all done by January 20. There was silence. After a few seconds, the commish stirred to speak. I turned to face him as he slid his hand away from his mouth and stroked his chin. He nodded slowly and grunted. Makes sense. Mediocrity lit up, and the new lawyer on the scene on my left spoke up and began exploring the advantages of it aloud. Rudy chimed in, and within minutes they had it all worked out. It was narrow, so it was not too objectionable. It generated an answer, and depending upon the outcome, it gave a route to Trump. I stayed another 30 minutes as they bounced the idea around with a spark of excitement growing. Finally, they said they would be working on details, and maybe even calling the president, and I took that as my cue to leave. I said goodbye to them and put my coat on. As I turned to leave, the mayor came and shook my hand. Then he tapped my chest with his finger and said quietly, regretfully, "If only we had another month." Truly, I had watched 2 months slide by Mayor Giuliani and his team displaying no organization or progress. Watching them trying to get anything done was like watching half a dozen monkeys trying to fuck a football. But now I was hearing, "If only we had another month." They could have had another decade, and it would not have made a difference. They were the wrong people. Rudy, because he should likely no longer be handling complex litigation, he certainly should not be handling complex litigation regarding cyber, and because he'd rather spend his days doing podcasts. A former government employee who was so mediocre we all came to suspect was sent as an agent of disruption, and others with their focus on a pot of cash that, at last report, was $300 million and growing. I walked the snow-covered midnight streets of Washington, D.C. back to my hotel, and finished packing for my departure. The next day, the 8th, I checked out, experiencing yet again at the discontent I feel every time I have affairs that take me to D.C. Discontent with people whose sense of accomplishment is so skewed. Bureaucrats measure their output within the paradigm of thwarting other factions, not in anything that normal people would count as accomplishment. At the staggering cost to the country of D.C., at the staggering wealth that has accumulated there, D.C. suburbs now contains 7 of America's 10 richest counties. Slate, September 2012. It has become Hunger Games without the archery. But there were people I had gotten to know over the previous several months, had grown to like and respect, and I had the opportunity to visit with most of them individually and say goodbye. I returned to my home in Utah by Saturday the 9th, feeling under the weather, but intent on writing the story that you have been reading in these installments. By the next day, I realized I had picked something up, and on the morning of Monday, January 11, I tested positive for COVID, as I had come to suspect. I took it easy for a few days with a fever of 101, still brushing it off, telling myself that on a flu scale of 1 through 10, this is a 2. They shut down the world for this? I woke Thursday, January 14, feeling almost fine, with a temperature back under 100. I thought I was through it. But by afternoon I began feeling ill again, and within an hour my temperature was 105.4. I barely made it to a hospital, and when I did they put me on monoclonal antibodies due to risk factors too numerous and depressing to list. Dealing with that, and the COVID fog that followed, cost me over a week. Near the end of that, on January 20, on the day that Biden was sworn in as president, I got 2 phone calls from 2 different Trump White House staffers. They wanted to tell me a story before they left the White House for the last time. The stories they told me overlapped and matched in detail. I will relate it here. On January 18, some loyal staffers had been visiting with Trump in his office for what was supposed to be a 10-minute goodbye. But the discussion had turned to the election, and before long, Trump was rehashing the decisions he had made, wondering where he had made mistakes. The subject turned to Sydney, Mike, and me, and the plan we had brought the White House. Trump walked through it with those staffers for 20 minutes, I was told, before it clicked for him. "That's it?" he asked angrily. "That's all they wanted to do? Count paper ballots in 6 counties?" Trump excitedly explored the idea, saw how simple it would be, and even brought up the possibility that it might not be too late, with his last 48 hours in office, to cause it to happen. The meeting dragged on well over an hour, the 2 sources told me, and they left with Trump fired up about the idea, with instructions given to them that they should figure out that afternoon a way that it could be executed in the last 2 days he had as president. But an hour later, their office got a phone call. The president had had further consultations with senior staff, had been dissuaded, and the younger staffers were instructed to drop the idea.